Thanks, Salma. Really helpful and gives us a good broad context of today's discussion. I'm going to move over to Mirza Saaib Beg, who's an international lawyer, and he's a Kashmiri himself. So if I can ask him to speak now.
Thank you. In the limited 5 minutes that have been given to me, I want to make 5 points. Firstly, the United Kingdom's legal obligation towards the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir as it existed in 1947. Second, the legislative changes taking place. Third, that self-determination is not an anti-Indian or anti-Pakistan position. It's only a pro-democracy position. Fourth, the intellectual dishonesty in a selective portrayal of Kashmir only as an issue of human rights. And finally, the role of Labour Party as a responsible opposition. The United Kingdom is not a mere observer in this dispute. It is a party to a controversial international treaty on which India bases the legality of its claim, that is the instrument of accession. Article 370 is a representation of that treaty. Just like the United Kingdom is signatory to the agreement guaranteeing Hong Kong's autonomy from Beijing, the United Kingdom is also signatory to the instrument of accession guaranteeing the autonomy of Kashmir from India, as well as a reference to the Kashmiri people for final settlement of this dispute. But the UK has failed to affirm that they have a legal right and a legal responsibility to raise any breaches of this treaty with India. On this point, it is essential to understand that the issue in Kashmir is not about restoring Article 370, but rather about treating Kashmiris as equal human beings with the full capacity to decide our own future. Therefore, my first submission to you is that your obligation to address the issue of Kashmir is not merely a moral obligation, it is a legal obligation, the failure of which is an abdication, a dereliction of duty. My second point is on the legislative changes. Like the Domicile Law and the proposed Delimitation Act that India is furiously pursuing through an unelected bureaucracy to disenfranchise the people of Kashmir and cause irreversible demographic changes. Passed during the COVID pandemic, it grants eligible Indians the right to settle in Kashmir in contravention of the 4th Geneva Convention, Rule 130. The deforestation to set up new industries and make room for the new domiciles will cause an irreparable impact on the ecology and livelihood of the people of Kashmir. But most importantly, it is aimed at frustrating any future possibility of a democratic referendum or self-determination. My third point is on self-determination. Given the response from some groups in the UK calling it anti-Indian, I want to make the nuanced point here that supporting the unfettered and unconditional right of self-determination of the Kashmiri people is not an anti-Indian position, because the right of self-determination is not India's to give or to take. It is our inherent right as a people. India supports freedom for cases outside the territorial control of India, where it is expedient to their interest, in Balochistan, in Bangladesh, but not in Kashmir. But there are Indians who believe in the right of self-determination or plebiscite or a reference to the Kashmiri people to decide this dispute, such as the father of India's constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, or Arundhati Roy, Prashant Bhushan, or Gautam Navlakha, to name a few. Kashmir's liberation struggle can be placed within a broader context of global decolonization. So advocating for the right to self-determination is not an anti-India position. It is only a position anti an illegal occupation. It needs to be highlighted that on the Pakistani side, there appears to be an evolution of thought on this issue. Their Prime Minister has recently voiced that Kashmiris should be free to choose any future, whether we choose to join Pakistan or remain independent. My fourth and final argument pertains to the language of human rights discourse on Kashmir. Human rights violations do not take place in a vacuum. They are the effect or the result of something. And if we do not discuss what that something is, which is what the Kashmiris are asking for, that is causing the human rights violations, it is an intellectual dishonesty. You must look at the etymology and not just the effect, because even if the human rights violations stop, the issue of Kashmir is not resolved. Kashmir is not an issue of human rights alone. It is a political issue that requires clear and concrete political solutions. But even when assessed on Labour's commitment to uphold human rights, there is lack of action. The United Kingdom's recent human rights sanctions regime makes no mention of Kashmir. The Human Rights and Democracy report that was laid before the Parliament on 16th of July, just 4 days ago, has not given due regard to Kashmir, and it merely makes a passing reference to Kashmir under the head of freedom of expression. The Labour Party must question the Tory government on their whitewashing of serious violations of human rights and irrefutably undemocratic actions in Kashmir. In a year where we have been undemocratically divided into two union territories, one which has even been robbed of a legislature, In a year where we have seen mass incarceration with no legal charge, a ban on free press, torture and killings, the Labour Party must question the government on this conspicuous omission of Kashmir from the Human Rights Policy and the Human Rights and Democracy Report. We urge you that it is now time to declare that India has breached international obligations. The Labour Party must prepare a comprehensive response using legal, political, economic, and even moral persuasion. The only question that arises for the Labour Party is whether your legal obligation towards Kashmiris is going to be treated merely as an unfortunate complication in the pursuit of electoral interests, or whether you see this as an opportunity to lead the way in showing the world and the United Kingdom that the United Kingdom understands how to behave with integrity, just like the Labour Party has historically taken similar stands for struggles in the past. The Kashmir conflict is neither a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, nor is it an internal matter for India. It is a threat to regional and global security, considering India's, Pakistan's, and China's established record of hostile engagement. It is also of substantial concern to the British Kashmiri diaspora living in the United Kingdom, who are one of the largest minority communities here. To begin with, we want to see your leadership as a responsible opposition in holding the UK government to account on their silence on Kashmir. And in the long term, we want the Labour Party to appreciate the point that we Kashmiris see ourselves as self-affirmed citizens of our state with the full capacity to decide the future of our sovereignty. Unless the Labour Party can appreciate this basic point, any imagination of a peaceful future in Kashmir is futile. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that we have towards the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirza. Very succinct points, and I appreciate you maintaining the time as well. If I can now go to Ben Emerson, QC, who's a well-known British barrister specializing in public international law, human rights, and humanitarian law. Over to you, Ben.
Hi, let me unmute myself. Although obviously I may express myself in slightly different language to the previous speakers, I think in the end, the conclusion comes to much the same thing, which is that far and away the most important question is whether or not the circumstances are such that the international community is under an obligation to view this as a matter which pierces the defence that says it's an internal question for India. In other words, is this a concern, this situation a concern of the international community legitimately, or is it not? And that question itself is one of those issues that states ping-pong around in international law in order to meet their own political interests.